just whatever we decided.
Sunday night at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN's Q&A.
A panel of historians talks about what life was like for freedmen after the Civil War and the overall successes and failures of Reconstruction. They discuss educational opportunities, land redistribution, and voting rights, as well as the politics behind these Reconstruction measures. This panel was part of the annual Lincoln Forum Symposium. It's about an hour and 15 minutes.
The title of this panel may be a little bit deceiving. It's, if I can read it here, voting rights for Black freedmen. What went right and what went wrong? So it seems to be couched in the terms of voting rights, and it's really about Reconstruction. I think you all know that and get it, because what undermines the whole progressive effort for Reconstruction is the lack of voting rights for those freed men and women. So we're going to expand this beyond voting, but we just couldn't get there as a nation with the 13th Amendment, final freedom, with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It didn't give voting rights to the African Americans. And neither did the 14th Amendment with its equal protection and due process. It took the 15th Amendment. And of course, that didn't work either because of every effort by some to deny African Americans this great franchise of voting. Why do you think people come to this country? One of the things is the ability to choose their own representatives. So we have a great panel. I don't say that every time that we have a panel, but we have we have a great one today. Joan Wah, who's vice chair for academic personnel and the professor of history at UCLA. But what so impresses me is the groundbreaking work that she did with her U.S. grant, American Hero, American Myth. And as I've told her more than once, it has done so much to restore the reputation of a real hero, Ulysses S. Grant. Next is, of course, Douglas Edgerton, professor of history at Lemoyne College in Syracuse. And he doesn't know it, although I've tried to allude it when I speak with him, that he really has been a mentor to me in understanding Reconstruction with the legal, political, and cultural implications. And he did that through his wonderful book, The Wars of Reconstruction, The Brief Violent History of America's Most Progressive Era. His newest book is terrific too, Thunder at the Gates, The Black Civil War Regiments That Redeemed America. And finally, Edna Green Medford, our executive board member of the Lincoln Forum, frequent speaker here, chairman of the department and professor of history at Howard University, co-author with me and Harold Holzer on Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, Three Views, and her own volume, Lincoln and Emancipation, part of the SIU Press's Concise Lincoln series. So before I ask each of them to make a few introductory remarks, I've asked each, and they've agreed to speak for 3 to 5 minutes, and then I will give them some questions, and then we'll open the floor for you, and we hope there are many questions from you. But for many Americans, Reconstruction is still remembered, if it is remembered at all, as a period of racial anarchy, political failure, and the humiliation of the defeated South. Indeed, it is probably fair to say that Americans' impressions of the era have been shaped, if only half-consciously, by films such as Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, with their caricatures of predatory Yankee carpetbaggers and scalawags, more than by detailed knowledge of what actually happened in the South between 1865 and 1876 and in the years that followed. It is a sometimes inspiring, but more often deeply shocking story that reveals the nation at its best and worst when newly freed slaves and idealists, both black and white, struggled heroically against white terrorism to preserve the rights that Union armies had won on the battlefield, and that Republican members of Congress affirmed in the years after the war. But, I think we have to see Reconstruction, too, not as bad policy further doomed by corruption and incompetence, but as a profoundly forward-looking program that was subverted by organized violence, domestic terrorism. The central question about Reconstruction is usually, why did it fail, as opposed to ended, which hints that the process itself was somehow flawed and contributed to its own passing. So the first question from me to Professor Joan Waugh is, did Reconstruction fail?
Whoa. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'm going to pander to the audience for 1 second or 2 seconds and tell you how much I've enjoyed attending my first Lincoln Forum, both as a presenter and as a member of the audience, and getting to meet you. You're terrific. I will say that that Reconstruction gets an F grade now that we're all professors, and it always has in terms of the history books. First, it was awarded an F grade by the Lost Cause historians. Then it was awarded an F grade by the 1950s and 60s historians, and it's still being awarded an F grade for different reasons. And I think that's something that we should talk about. I always tell my students, and I know this is a pat answer, but I think we can flesh it out, that Reconstruction is a qualified success and a qualified failure. What do I mean by that? I mean that it was a qualified failure in that it didn't live up to the promise of equality that many African Americans expected at the end of the war, and many white abolitionists, for example. It was a qualified success, and here I may be a little bit outside the current consensus about Reconstruction, in that for the people living at the time, and I say the majority of the Northerners who voted on Reconstruction issues, that the premier concern was, would the Union stay together after this terrible war? The Union stayed together. The United States persisted. They considered that a great, magnificent achievement. So we have to understand, even if we don't agree that it was, we have to understand that that was an overwhelming consensus confirmed in the elections of 1868, 1872, and 1876. I'll leave you with that for now, but also I want to tell you my favorite quote from about that was originally not applied to Reconstruction, but I have applied it to Reconstruction, and that is by the novelist and social critic William Dean Howells, who said, "What the American public always wants is a tragedy with a happy ending." And that is what Appomattox provides for generations to come, and that is what we are discontented about in Reconstruction.
Yes, thank you very much. It also raises the question, I think it begs the question on, really, did the Civil War end at Appomattox? And I think if you read the good work of Professor Michael Vorenberg, who wrote the great book on the 13th Amendment, Final Freedom, he has an opinion that, of course, as we all do, that Appomattox really didn't end our Civil War. So for Professor Doug Egerton, we talk about voting rights being denied African Americans, and people of color. What about any effect on voting rights in the North, for example?
Let me start also by echoing Joan to say how nice it is to be here. I had my picture taken last night at dinner with President Lincoln, which doesn't happen to me very often, and that was nice. Also at dinner last night, my friend Catherine warned me to speak slowly, which is not one of my skills, and especially when given 3 minutes to answer a long question, I'm probably going to talk fast. Let me put it this way. In my book, I tried to write about Black activists, North, South, East, West. And of course, you have conservative Democrats like Andrew Johnson who don't even want to use the term Reconstruction. They prefer to use the term restoration, implying that the war's over, all is forgiven. And then, of course, you have white Republicans who use the term Reconstruction. But even the so-called radicals like Thad Stevens, when you ask them what Reconstruction is, they say it's a policy for the defeated Confederacy. When you ask Frederick Douglass, he says it's a national policy. Douglass once said this is a war for national reclamation. He said he wants an abolition war and an abolition peace. And of course, bear in mind, as we all know, he had Lincoln in his last speech, he'd gone to Richmond, he came back, gave that speech in which he said that he believed that voting rights was something to be earned. And he thought that the 179,000 Black men in blue uniforms had earned that right. And he said our more intelligent Negroes, quote unquote, people like Frederick Douglass had earned that right. And Lincoln's modern critics, people like Lerone Bennett, are not impressed. And okay, I mean, there's 4 million freed Americans at that moment, half of whom are men. So 200,000 is a small drop in the bucket, but let's put that in a larger context. When Lincoln says those words, really on the eve of his assassination, Black men can vote on an equal basis with white men only in 5 New England states. In New York, where I live, there's a property qualification imposed on Blacks going back to 1821 that's not imposed on whites. So Frederick Douglass, who owns a house and a business in Rochester, he can vote. But his son, Sergeant Major Lewis Douglass, who's badly wounded at Fort Wagner, can't. Worse in Lincoln's Illinois, worse in Chase's Ohio. No Blacks can vote in Indiana. And of the 179,000 Black men who serve, 38,000 are born free in the North. Probably all of you have seen the film Glory. It's a wonderful film because everything wrong you could possibly get wrong in a movie. And of course, it gives you the impression that all these soldiers in the 54th are runaway slaves from the South. The largest contingent, state contingent in the 54th is from here in Pennsylvania. New York is number 2, Ohio is number 3. And so these men are serving, fighting, and dying, and living in states that do not allow them to vote. So when it comes down to whether this is a success or a failure, if you are a Black soldier who comes back to Ohio and the 15th Amendment is ratified, you never lose that right to vote. And so that one of the things that Reconstruction gets right is enfranchising Black men all across the North.
Thank you very much. And Professor Edna Green Medford, from freed Blacks' point of view, what was their reaction to what was going on after Appomattox? Was there really anything positive about what was dreamed about or anticipated in the efforts for reconstruction or restoration?
I'd like to first echo the sentiment. Sorry, I never remember to do that. I usually can carry my voice. I want to echo the sentiment of my fellow panelist regarding the special place that this is and the special audience that you are. In the 21 years of this organization, I have been here for 19, and I always return because this is such a special place. At the end of the war, African Americans expected full citizenship. And what that meant was not just voting rights or political voice, but it also meant all of the rights that other Americans had shared for all of the years that the nation had existed. And so they expected to be able to control their own destiny. They expected economic independence. They wanted an education. They simply wanted to be allowed to exercise their American birthright. We all agree that Reconstruction was tragic. It was tragic not necessarily because no one had a plan for the freed people. There was a plan that was developed eventually, but it was because the kinds of accomplishments that occurred during this period were not sustained. And so, it's easy to say that everything went wrong, but everything didn't go wrong. Actually, there were many accomplishments during this period. One of the most important, of course, was after people got their freedom, they were able to at least attempt to reconstitute their families. There were so many people who had been separated during slavery. So one of the first things they're attempting to do is to find loved ones. They weren't always successful at that. In many instances, they were not successful at that, but they were at least trying to do that. Men could now at least have the expectation of taking care of their families, of protecting their families. That expectation was not always realized because of violence and all of the other things that happened of a negative sort during this period. But the expectation was there. There were some people who did get economic independence, and they were able to do it by becoming subsistence farmers. They didn't want to enter the commercial market because that would make them beholden to white men. And so they were able to acquire a small piece of land. Soldiers, for instance, had bounties. They used those funds and they pooled their resources with other African Americans and were able to purchase land. That's not the case for most African Americans, but it's true for a few of them, depending upon what part of the country they lived in. Education was extremely important and possible for them at this time. As a consequence of a great deal of effort by the Freedmen's Bureau, by the American Missionary Association and other organizations, and largely by the freed people themselves, schools were established, not just elementary and secondary schools, but schools of higher learning as well. Now, we know that some of those early schools that called themselves colleges were really not. They were normal schools to train teachers, but that was extremely important. And at least one of them, Howard University, I have to give that plug. I do want to go back to work on Monday. Howard actually was established as a university. So it didn't have just a normal school, but it also had a divinity school, a law school, a medical school, almost from the very beginning. And so the important thing about that is people realized that there were some African Americans who were ready to get that level of education. Most were not because they had been denied literacy while they were enslaved. But there were few who had been freeborn and some enslaved people who had been able to get an education who were ready for this advance in education.
Thank you very much. Does anyone wish to comment on any comments made by your fellow panelists? If not, we'll continue. Joan Waugh, I think it's true that Reconstruction dominated Grant's presidency. Unlike many, he knew it brought liberation, not occupation, and empowered, or should have empowered, African Americans in states where they were a majority or large minority. So can you comment on what role you see of President Grant in the whole issue of Reconstruction and the progressive philosophy that it was intended to provide or give?
Do I have 3 minutes for this?
Yes, you do.
3 minutes. Yes, I can comment. Richard Current, an historian maybe some of you are familiar with, said this about Grant. He was commander-in-chief during the Reconstruction phase of the continuing Civil War. Although I have to say, I remind this audience, and I would emphasize that it's important to know, to think, to put this in your pipe and smoke it, that in the chaotic few months after Appomattox, the Confederate armies disbanded, the Confederate States of America was gone, and there was nothing to replace it. The majority of enslaved people were still not officially free, and in many states, the owners tried to tell them that they weren't free. This was a period. It's really dramatic, and fascinating. And the fate of African Americans in the South, enslaved in the South, and as well as Southern whites, remained in the hands of the politicians in Washington, D.C., and at the fate of elections. And so this dynamic, this tennis game back and forth is fascinating, and to me has always been one of the most exciting periods in American history. As far as Grant was concerned, last night and yesterday I heard a lot of people say, well, he, of course, including Mr. Williams, say that he was utterly unprepared for the presidency. What president is, the most prepared president? I'm going on a rant. I can feel it. I need to stop. The most prepared president in American history was James Buchanan. Excellent job, James. How could you not be prepared if you're a senior commander in the Union Army, the Union general by the end who was identified as winning the war for the United States, and tasked with not only fighting, developing strategy, but also dealing with politicians from Washington, D.C. and policy from Washington, D.C. that changed from one day to the other in your occupation of various territories. He dealt with issues of emancipation. He knew it was not going to be easy. And he was also commander-in-chief during Reconstruction, overseeing military reconstruction. He brought to his presidency 8 or 9 months being the ad interim Secretary of War in a comic opera situation where Stanton was removed for his office. The reputation of Grant as president has been deeply influenced by the lost cause historians who found him a dictator, a Caesar, as he was called by the Democrats of that day, and utterly incompetent and stupid. And the view now, of course, since the 1960s, is that he didn't do enough. But if we can read the volumes of the U.S. Grant papers, now presided over by the brilliant John Marszalek and his crew in Starkville, Mississippi, how great is that? You can find out that he was a serious president. He struggled, yes. No president who's been elected to the office doesn't feel that he's walked into to use a 20th century term, the helicopter propeller. You're bloodied, you're in pieces, but you learn in your job. And I would argue that U.S. Grant did learn in his job, but he did have a hard task. The hard task facing the people who believed in bringing civil rights and voting rights to African Americans in the South had to face the fact that beyond emancipation, there was no agreement on what, except in the African American population and their supporters, was their agreement on what could be done in terms of civil rights and voting rights. Because one of the goals of Reconstruction was to figure that out. But the premier goal of Reconstruction was to reunite the United States. How could you do that? Incorporating, reunion, restoration, reconciliation, the 3 R's, had to deal with embittered white Southerners who still were the majority of the population and still had the power. So this was a very, very difficult task that Grant had before him when he was elected president in 1868. He tried to enforce the 14th and especially the 15th Amendment, and he passed laws before he was reelected, the Force Acts that made the election of 1872, which used the federal government coming down in southern states where the KKK was suppressing the vote, as we like to say, and putting the force of the federal government behind breaking up the KKK and allowing the freest and fairest election that could be imagined or possible in 1872. But it quickly broke down. But he himself believed that African American, once given the suffrage, you couldn't take it away from them, and you shouldn't. And he kept to that the rest of his, kept to that belief and tried to put it into policy the rest of his presidency. It's such a complicated story. I've already gone over my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, you have. And in my court, the buzzer would have rung to say, but this is a court of equity, and we try to be totally fair. So, moving to another subject, we'll come back, Joan, I think, to Grant, because he is such an important and telling figure, I think. But Doug Egerton, what about the factor of there being this war in the West with our real Native Americans, now called American Indians, and versus the troops that were required for Reconstruction duty in the South? What effect did this have on either one theater or the other?
It had a huge impact, and the way, of course, historians tend to impose periodization on American history. So we have, you look at any textbook, and here's the Civil War, and then there's Reconstruction, and there's Westward Movement, and there's the Gilded Age. But of course, they all overlap. And one of the main sources I used in writing this book were Freedmen Bureau reports, and I would look especially at Black Belt counties on the eve of elections. And the one kind of constant theme they're writing back to Washington, these again are bureau officers in the South, saying, please don't send any more soldiers out west. We need them here. We can't have free elections and fair elections here in Alabama unless we have more soldiers. And I mean, the Little Bighorn, of course, happens in '76. Reconstruction is not yet over. And so that's one of the things that really hurts Reconstruction is they need that military presence in the South. And part of it, of course, is the war is over and soldiers want to go home. They want to go back to their farms and their businesses and their families and their wives. And they're mustered out, and so of course the army becomes disproportionately black at that point, because a lot of these former slaves, and again 179,000 black men serve, 141,000 were born into slavery. So they stay in the army, but then they keep getting sent out west. And so again, we're all told in grade school that one of the deals made by Hayes in the contested election of 1876 is that the White South demands the withdrawal of the federal army, which they do, but only as a symbolic gesture. In June of 1876, there are 2,800 soldiers in the entire former Confederacy. I bet there's more cops today in Philadelphia than there were in the entire South in 1876. And so, of course, what the White South wants when they make that demand of Hayes is a kind of symbolic gesture that federal government is walking away from black soldiers and black Southerners. But it really it's the wars in the Dakotas that really hurt Reconstruction, because again, those soldiers are needed down there to enforce voting rights in Alabama, Mississippi, and not out in the West. And so that really hurts Reconstruction a lot.
Right. Thank you very much. And for Edna Green Medford, were there really any substantial or significant economic gains achieved by former slaves, freedmen, and women during this helter-skelter period of Reconstruction?
Well, historians have always argued that the system of sharecropping had to be implemented because there was no money in the South at the end of the war. And to a large extent, that's true. Sharecropping did not have to be the institution, the economic institution that was established. However, to some extent, African Americans are supportive of a sharecropping system only because it allows them to work the land without someone standing over them with the lash. So the land is actually being rented for a share of the crop. The problem with sharecropping was that landowners who may have also been supplying the tools and the draft animals and the housing and everything else and ran the local store did not keep records that were fair to the people who were sharecropping on their land. So people could never get an even break. But despite that, despite the fact that the majority of people were sharecroppers, certainly in the Deep South, there were parts of the country where there was no tobacco production or cotton production or sugar production, where people worked in a diversified economy before the end of slavery and had to deal with that diversified economy when slavery had ended. It's in those areas that people are as close to being economically independent as possible. Some of them are actually able to acquire land because you've got a free Black population of people before the war who had been able to acquire some amount of land, and they're subdividing their acreage and selling to these folk, and they're becoming independent farmers. These are people as well who are in areas where they are cutting wood, or they're oystering, or they're fishing for a living, or they're involved in industry. So it really does depend upon what part of the country one is. So there is some economic advancement, but for the majority of African Americans, it does not exist. And to me, that is the true tragedy of Reconstruction, that the country had an opportunity perhaps to redistribute land. Certainly African Americans expected that 40 acres and a mule. And there were some people who did get that temporarily in South Carolina, in the Sea Islands area, the coastal areas of South Carolina and Georgia, but that land was taken away from them when the original owners returned to the area and were pardoned by Johnson. So the only thing I can see that would have really ensured economic independence would have been finding a way to make sure that these free people got the land that they had been cultivating their entire lives, and that didn't happen.
Exactly. Did the Homestead Act that Lincoln supported in 1862, it was on the table during the Buchanan administration, but never was passed. It did pass in the Lincoln administration. Did that help at all?
The Homestead Act helps to some extent, but the majority of people don't benefit from that.
Right. Doug, you've heard me say that Reconstruction's problems began with what was arguably the worst decision that Abraham Lincoln made as president when he dropped from his 1864 reelection Hannibal Hamlin, the very capable and conscientious vice president, and replaced him with Andrew Johnson, the Unionist Democrat from Tennessee. Fearing defeat, I think, is one of the reasons in the November election, Lincoln writes the blind memorandum that he has his cabinet sign once it's sealed. Lincoln hoped to shore up the support among Northern Democrats and win the trust of voters in the reconquered areas of the seceded states. That's one of the reasons I think he went along with. We're not quite sure how Machiavellian Lincoln was in replacing Hamlin with Johnson. That's still up for grabs, I think, and is argued among many historians. But what about that decision to have Johnson become the vice president and eventually the president of the United States?
Sure. One of the great, of course, unanswerable questions is how things would have been different had Lincoln not gone to the theater on Good Friday. And you probably do the same thing too, but historians play this kind of odd game usually at conference bars. The 10 greatest presidents, the 10 worst presidents. Recently, there was a debate on Facebook, which president you'd want to have your back in a bar fight. Actually, Andy Jackson won that because he just liked to shoot things. Although Lincoln would have been a good guy to have you back. Back to the main point. I think for most historians, it's not that Lincoln was the only man for the job. It's that Andrew Johnson was the absolute worst man for the job. And you can look at all of his really bad policies and his animosity that he had toward Black Americans. The famous meeting that he has with Frederick Douglass is just infamous. And after Douglass leaves and Johnson turns to his secretary and said, I know Negroes like that. And of course, he didn't use the term Negro. Said he just wants to stick a knife in the white man. I mean, Johnson was a really, really bad guy. But why I think he actually wins the award over Buchanan as the worst president is because, and Buchanan's number 2, but I'll say Johnson's number 1 is the worst president because there's a moment of opportunity here, and he squanders it. And look at how the second President Johnson, in our lifetime, uses the mourning nation, mourning the death of John Kennedy, and pushes for civil rights. one of the things that really surprised me in writing the book is the large number of Northerners and Southerners who said in 65, it's over, we've lost. I mean, no less than James Longstreet writes a series of editorials saying we are a conquered people. He said, we fought, we lost, they won, and now we simply need to accept whatever rules they impose on us and move ahead. And of course, you've all seen the photographs. Charleston is burned, Columbia is burned, Richmond is burned. I mean, the South is just lost hundreds of thousands of young men. And this is a chance to really start fixing things. And is it going to be easy? Of course not. But instead of kind of digging his heels in, Johnson just says to the white South, well, kind of go about your business. And the people he appoints when Congress is out of session as these military governors of the South, people like William Marvin in Florida. Marvin says that this was a white man's war. Well, the only important battle fought in Florida was Olustee in the 54th and 55th. Were there and fought and bled and died at Olustee. And so he appoints people who had been Unionists, they'd been opposed to secession, but they had also been collaborators with the Confederacy in these important governorships. And basically says, just kind of go about your business. And he writes to the governor of Perry of South Carolina and says, inform me from time to time what's happening in South Carolina. That's it. Not here are the rules, but inform me from time to time. So again, we'll never know how things would have been different. But what was it that Mary once said about her husband? She said, once Abe digs those big heels in, there's no power on earth that could change him. And when Lincoln meets with Frederick Douglass, they're talking about soldiers and unequal pay for black soldiers. And Lincoln says, I move slowly, but no one can ever accuse me of moving in the wrong direction. And so for me, Johnson's crime is that he squanders this moment in which things really could have been different. And what I found so depressing about writing the book on Reconstruction, and this is North and South, the battles that are fought again in the 1950s, 1960s, people who pay with their lives again in our lifetime, is because it wasn't done right the first time. And I think things would have been very, very different had Lincoln not gone to Ford's Theater.
Thank you. Joan, we've heard from Judge Steve Sofakis, a good friend who's a county judge in Baltimore County, that President Grant's hands were really tied by the United States Supreme Court in 1875 when they issued their opinion in U.S. versus Cruikshank, saying that the federal courts did not have jurisdiction to enforce the KKK Act, so-called, that took away from the commander-in-chief and chief magistrate the tools that he needed to enforce what we're speaking about, that is civil liberties and the rights of citizenship, which certainly is not just freedom, but the rights that are attendant to freedom. So do you agree with that? Do you agree that was the reason that in the second term, or at least towards the second term of the Grant administration, he was inhibited on the enforcement of the civil rights legislation?
Yes.
That's what I like from my lawyers, but I never get it. I never get one-word answers.
I think that was certainly a big turning point. Another big turning point was the elections of 1874, in which, for the first time since before the war, Grant had to deal with a Democratic-controlled Congress, and the northern people were withdrawing their support for the kind of Reconstruction envisioned by Congress in 1868 and bringing U.S. Grant to the presidency. I do think that, I hate to be the one who's our 21st ideas about racial progress and equity were not there in the 19th century. 19th century people were racist. We can call them that. That's what they were, white people, most white people. And the thing is that Edna touched on the most important factor to Northern whites was free labor. And they wanted African Americans in the South, in the freed people, to have security in their person and security and the ability to move and sell their free labor. It was so simplistic, and they didn't really want to know the details, but once they were reassured to themselves that that was what was going on, Republicans voted for that. And the reason that it seems to me that Abraham Lincoln acceded, I don't know how much he had to do with the selection of Andrew Johnson, who was a wartime governor of Tennessee. So he wasn't a ridiculous choice. Abraham Lincoln did not know he was going to be assassinated while watching a comedy at Ford's Theater, of course. But the thing that he was concerned about that he did see in the future was establishing the Republican Party as a national party. And he saw Andrew Johnson and the renaming of the Republican Party for the 1864 election, the Union Party, as a way to do that, because he knew that the loyal slaveholding states of Tennessee, of Missouri, of Kentucky, of Maryland would be a problem for the Republican Party in the post-war era. So I think we don't have to agree with his decision. There is no person on earth that thinks Andrew Johnson is a good president. I don't think, in this room anyway. But I mean, if we put ourselves in the shoes of the people who were living in the past, we can understand at least their reasoning. It is not. That's all I have to say.
Right.
Frank,
Thank you.
could
yes,
panelists
please.
ask each other
Absolutely.
questions?
Absolutely.
Great.
Please do.
To what extent, Joan, does this decision of the Republican Party to support voting rights in the South for African Americans, based on the idea that this is the group that's going to help the Republican Party stay in power?
You are exactly right. The African Americans comprised 80% of the Republicans in the South during the period that they made every effort to secure that vote. It was one of the few times in our history that so perfectly melded policy, power, and idealism. And it had mixed results, obviously. And that's all I want to say.
Can I just add a word?
Yes, please, Doug.
Yeah, I mean, politicians can do the right thing for the wrong reason. And I agree with you both. Lincoln got 1,337 votes in 1860 in Virginia, almost all of which is now West Virginia. And of course, he wins in 60 because he's running against two Democrats and John Bell. He wins in 64 because the South isn't having an election that year. And of course, Grant loses New York in 68. But thanks to the Reconstruction Act, he carries both Carolinas. And my students always find it amazing that the working class former slaves in Alabama can vote before working class black men in Syracuse. And so the light bulb goes on. I mean, Grant understands how the Electoral College works. And of course, South Carolina, Mississippi have a black majority. So if black men can vote all across the South, those are going to be a lock in the Electoral College. And so, of course, what does Grant say in his inaugural address? Let's make quick work of the 15th Amendment. He wants to be reelected in 72. And black men are going to make that happen. Black men basically got him elected in 68. Now he wants to get black votes all across the North as well, and to make sure he's going to hold on to those votes in Mississippi and South Carolina.
Doug, I have to ask you a question. Did New York try and rescind its vote on the 15th Amendment?
No, they finally give in. But in 1860, now again, this goes back to 1821 when they have a new constitution. And of course, slavery still exists in New York State until 1827. And so they eliminate the final property qualifications for white voters in 1821, but it imposed this new one on black voters. And so they have a ballot referendum in 1860 to get rid of this. And moderate Republicans in New York band together with Democrats and vote it down. So New York, Lincoln carries New York handily at 60. But the ballot referendum, which is going to enfranchise black New Yorkers, goes down. So some of the same voters go to the polls and vote for Lincoln in November in 60, and then vote against black voting rights in the Empire State. So they're not happy about it. But New York finally was limping along. It's 67 when they finally integrate public schools, and so they're kind of moving in the right direction.
The story of the 14th and 15th Amendment is very much like the film that you saw on Lincoln and the passage of the 13th Amendment. These amendments would not have been passed in any other era. It was made possible by the tremendous revolution of freeing 4 million enslaved people, and it's what did they call it? It's a sausage making factory. There were lots of shady deals done, and the 14th and 15th Amendments only passed because it was a requirement of the former Confederate states that they had to accept it before they could come into the Union. It was very hard to get a lot of northern states to get to that magic number.
Ed, you mentioned appropriately the rights of citizenship, and that's more than just freedom. The right to vote, the right to serve on jurors, the right to serve in the military, and the right to a free education too. And what about that? What about this literacy issue and the quest for knowledge and to be able to read and write that occurred during this period?
Sure. At the end of the war, 70% of the African American population in the South was illiterate because people were not allowed. Well, there were laws against teaching enslaved people to read and write. Some people were able to acquire literacy anyway, despite those laws. But African Americans from the very beginning understood that if they were going to be able to maintain their freedom, they would have to be able to read and write. If they were going to become full-fledged American citizens, they would have to be educated. Now, it's not that they thought that they had to be better than anyone else, because there were certainly a lot of white men and women out there who were not educated, who were not literate either, because there was no universal public